Okay, so most of this is going to be a review. There's going to be a few little things that we're going to add in, but not a whole lot. We've been talking about how the body filters blood. And along with filtering blood, the kidneys are responsible for keeping all those electrolyte concentrations evened out, right? We've seen that. There's osmoreceptors. There's lots of different types of ways that the kidneys can maintain our concentrations of fluids in our body. So, you already know a lot about the composition of body fluids. So we're going to add a few terms to what you know and maybe clarify a few things that we haven't talked about in a great detail earlier, but we have introduced some of these concepts to you. Of course, we know water is the universal solvent. Anybody know about what the water composition is of the body? Common misconception. If you're a baby, brand new baby, just born, about 73%. If you're an adult male, a good healthy adult male, going to be about 60%, and a good healthy adult female is about 50%. So we're a large majority water. Most of that water, or a good bit of water, of course, it makes up the skeletal muscle. So obviously, the more muscle you have, the more water makeup, right? Versus the amount of fat, okay? Remember, fat and water, they don't really mix. So if you have a lot of fat, not a lot of water there. So if you're made up of more muscle, your water composition is going to be very different from an individual who weighs exactly the same and has the exact same height, but maybe composed of more fat. So it makes a difference about body composition, about how much water. Now, why is a male and a female so different in their compositions percentage? That's a 10% difference. And it's because the female is made up more of fat, and the male is made up more of skeletal. They have more skeletal muscle. So there is going to be a difference. About 60%. So there's a lot of water. Water is the universal solvent of most everything, but including the body. What is in this universal solvent? Things need to be able to dissolve, right? Mainly what you're going to find is two categories. You've either got your electrolytes or your non-electrolytes. Does anybody know what that means? Without reading, do you know what an electrolyte is? All right, those are good examples. Definitionally, do you understand? What is an electrolyte, Gatorade? Yep, you can get your electrolyte. You've heard all your life, get your electrolytes. Why? Why do you need to get those? Okay, you can sweat it out, and you're right. We need those electrolytes for just common body functions, muscle contraction, nerve impulses, right? Those electrolytes are important. But what is the definition of an electrolyte? What makes it different from a non-electrolyte? Very good, John. Ions. The main definition of an electrolyte is dissociates in water. It's going to dissociate. Does everybody know what that means? So if you've got sodium chloride, salt, it dissociates into a sodium ion and a chloride ion. Does everybody understand that? Well, when it dissociates into a cation and an anion, which means it has a charge. And the word electrolyte means able to conduct an electrical stimulus, right? Able to conduct electricity. So having that charge, electrolytes do have the ability to conduct electricity, and they will have a positive or a negative charge. So any type of ions that you take in, when you eat salt, what happens to it? In your blood, what's going to happen to salt? It's going to dissociate is the word. It's going to dissociate. So you're going to have, for every molecule of salt that you eat, a sodium and a chloride ion will separate and dissociate into their ionic species, and you'll have a plus charge and a minus charge. So, and in your book, we're going to look at a graph, and you'll see how important sodium and chloride ion are to the body. But that's what an electrolyte is. A non-electrolyte is, of course, a substance that doesn't dissociate, and it usually is made up of covalent bonds. So no dissociation. Covalent bonds are, and if you remember back from Biology 1, we covered a whole chapter of chemistry a long time ago, I know for some of us. But most organic compounds, they were made up of covalent bonds. So the carbon is covalently bonded to the carbon. Remember, does anybody remember what organic compounds are made of? What's the definition of being organic? Carbon and hydrogen make up organic compounds. Most of the time you're going to have oxygen too. But you've got basically carbon and hydrogen. That's what an organic compound is. And these compounds don't dissociate. So glucose, being an organic compound that we take in as food, is not going to dissociate. Well, those are the four most abundant elements in our body: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. That's what your body is totally 100%, not 100%, that's me misspeaking, but 90-something% of your body is made up of those four elements. So electrolytes dissociate in water. Inorganic salts, all acids and bases dissociate. And some of the proteins are actually electrolytic. The most abundant are the solutes. Now, I want you to recall, tell me how are water and solutes related? Very good. Water always follows solutes. And a good rule of thumb to remember for A and P is water always follows sodium. So if sodium is being reabsorbed, you're always, or if sodium is being excreted, you're always going to have water excreted with it. That's just the way it goes. Now, your body has special mechanisms that can allow your body to reabsorb sodium without reabsorbing too much water. And we've talked about those mechanisms: renin-angiotensin, aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, all of those together. Those mechanisms actually regulate what your body keeps. But if you're losing sodium, you're almost inevitably losing water. But water always follows sodium. So, and it has to do with how much is dissolved. So you think about it like this: if you're an electrolyte and you dissolved into 2 particles, water follows the amount. It doesn't care what you are. It doesn't care how big you are. It's following how many little particles there are. So an electrolyte is going to contribute considerably to how many solute particles there are in the water or the plasma. So that's kind of important to understand. So they have a greater osmotic power than non-electrolytes because of this, because they do dissociate into 2 entities. And that's, one of the big things that controls water balance are these solute concentrations, especially from the electrolytes. So they do contribute to fluid shifts. They also determine the chemical and physical reactions of fluids because of their electrical properties. Now, at this point, I would like to distinguish between fluids in our bodies because where these fluids are makes a big difference. We've got basically an intracellular fluid and an extracellular fluid. The intracellular fluid, of course, is going to be all the fluid in the cell, intracellular, which is a large amount. You've got more fluid inside your cells than you have extracellular, about 2/3. And about 1/3 of it is the ECF. The ECF is everything, of course, outside of the cells, and we can break the ECF down into a couple of categories. We break ECF down into interstitial fluid and plasma, both of these being components of what is outside the cell. Interstitial fluid is the fluid between cells. And, of course, plasma is outside the blood. It's what's in our blood. We can also take and talk about things, fluids like synovial fluid in our joints. We can talk about fluids in our eyes, aqueous humor, those types of fluids that we have, but those basically fall into the category of interstitial fluids. So intracellular fluid, again, that's what's in the cells. Some of the things that I want you to notice when we're talking about ECF and ICF are going to be ion concentrations. Ion concentrations are very different internal and external to the cell. There's some general rules of thumb that we can follow. If we're looking inside the cell, there's not as much sodium and chlorine inside the cell. Those two ions are much more abundant here, outside the cell. So outside the cell, we have really high sodium concentrations, really high chloride concentrations. Everybody see that? There's a graph, and Candace has got it right here on page 997. I think it's right here. In this graph, you can actually see this compares, and again, ECF, remember, includes your blood plasma and your interstitial fluid. So when we talk about blood plasma and interstitial fluid, we're talking about extracellular fluids. So let's look comparatively. Interstitial fluid, what's inside the cell? Intracellular fluid, what's inside the cell, is denoted in yellow on page 997. Again, low sodium inside the cell. Everybody see that? What's really high inside the cell? Potassium. Being the major positive or cation inside the cell is potassium. Have we talked about sodium-potassium pumps? We have. So that's really important. What about an anion? Look at this, this phosphate. Really high phosphate anions inside the cell. Now let's look at the interstitial fluid, the IF. Again, we see really high sodium, of course, really low potassium, so it's the opposite, and then really low phosphates, but extremely high chlorides. And you'll notice blood plasma is the same way. And that's another extracellular fluid. Really high sodium, really high chloride ion here, much lower potassium and phosphates. So those are four major cations and anions that contribute to those fluids of the intracellular and extracellular fluids that you'll notice. One of the things that you'll notice that kind of changes a little bit are protein anions here. The blood plasma has a pretty good many, but the intracellular fluid has a lot of protein anions. So that's a little bit different. Whereas a lot of the things we talked about were see the red and the blue being extracellular fluids, pretty even here, pretty even. Magnesium concentrations pretty even, carbonate, chloride ion, until we get to the protein anions. Then you have a good bit of a difference. So, proteins, phospholipids, cholesterol, and neutral fats make up the bulk of dissolved solutes. So 90% in plasma are made up of these, 60% in the intracellular fluid, and 97% in the 60% in the interstitial fluid and 97% in the intracellular fluid. So make sure you have a good understanding of where I'm talking about. If I say ECF, you know what I'm talking about. If I say ICF, you know what I'm talking about. And then even further with the ECF, you know what I'm talking about with the IF and the plasma. Just make sure you kind of understand that. And make a note of what ions are present where. All right, so how do these, because of these ions and because of the solute concentrations, we just discussed that that's going to cause major shifts. So that helps our body to make the shifts homeostatically that need to be made to maintain the correct solute concentrations. So we have these osmotic and hydrostatic pressures as a result of how much of these ions that we actually have. And water moves freely by osmosis. What causes osmosis? It is the diffusion of water, but what's causing it? What causes the diffusion of water? Solute concentrations. So how much of that solute is there? If there's an abundance of sodium, what's going to happen in the ECF? What's going to happen to water? It's going to follow it. So it's going to move towards it, and that's how the fluid moves. It's going to follow that. So it's a two-way flow till it equilibrates. The water is following those solutes until it equilibrates and evens out homeostatically. There's different ways that ions can actually flow. We've talked about active mechanisms. We've talked about channels. We've talked about passive mechanisms. You remember the sodium-potassium pump that has been mentioned several times. So there's many different mechanisms that can get these ions where they need to go. But once they're where they need to be, water moves, and it moves by osmosis. So any change in the solute concentration of any compartment is going to lead to a net water flow somewhere, according to where those solute concentrations are. So looking at some of the different structures that we've mentioned, interstitial fluids. Of course, in the lungs, oxygen and CO2 are extremely important, right? Because that's the gas being exchanged. So oxygen and CO2 contribute to where water is going to be. So here's the interstitial fluid and blood plasma. So this is showing our ECF, right? And here's our intracellular fluid. So here's the tissues moving in and out. These gases swap back and forth. The nutrients that come into our intestinal tract and water swapping. Remember, those are solutes. They're adding to. So water is going to follow. It's going to move. Kidneys, big time nitrogenous waste. They're trying to get rid of that water ions. All of these things are going to help maintain homeostatic balance of water throughout the body, and it's so that these ions can be where they need to be, and our body's constantly monitoring those ions. All right. So basically, water intake to equal water output. So we're using up what we put in, about 2,500 mils per day. On average, the average adult needs about 2,500 mils for everything to work correctly. All your water intake is included in all your beverages, food, metabolic water. Any of those are going to contribute to this water intake. Your water output is everything that happens from urine. Urine, or that happens to be excreted as a result of urine. What is excreted as a result of urine is called sensible water loss. Insensible water loss is the water exchange that you lose between skin and lungs, which there's some evaporation that occurs there, and that's known as insensible loss. So both of those together, perspiration, feces, all of that, that's the water output. So water intake equaling water output, that's going to be about 2,500 mils on average. So what happens when this gets out of kilter? Let's say you haven't taken in enough water. We have what we call a thirst mechanism. Anybody remember what part of the brain initiates that thirst mechanism? Hypothalamus. Very good. Very good. So the hypothalamus has these receptors, and it's monitoring all these ion concentrations. So, remember, does anybody remember what the definition of osmolality is? Osmolality. What is osmolality? We talked about it last chapter. It's just basically the number of solutes dissolved in a kilogram of water. So, did I say a specific one? No. It's basically solute for solute. How much is dissolved in that? And this is our plasma. So that osmolality drops, meaning the some solutes have dropped. 2 to 3% of that drop is going to initiate the thirst reflex from the hypothalamus. So when you've lost about 2 to 3%, the hypothalamus says, "Hey, I'm thirsty." It doesn't take long to quench that thirst, right? Does not take long. And then angiotensin 2, or a receptor, is initiated. When was angiotensin 2? When was that mechanism instated? Right, so the renin-angiotensin system. And when does that usually kick in? As a result of blood pressure, low blood pressure, right? So it makes sense that that's going to kick in the reflex of wanting to drink because of low blood pressure. So dry mouth can be a result of that. And a substantial, does anybody know why a dry mouth results, or what causes that? Well, we've talked about dry mouth occurring in sympathetic mode, but it's because the saliva is made directly from the blood. And if there's not enough water there, and the body is, has dropped in that concentration, then the saliva is not going to be made like it's supposed to be made. And that's a result. That's going to make you thirsty, right? That's going to make you want to go drink something. So that's a good thing to occur. And, of course, substantial decreases in blood volume or blood pressure, which is going to enact that renin-angiotensin system. Drinking water creates inhibition of the thirst center. So it doesn't take long that you've drank enough water that you're going to quit. Even though, think about it for a second, you just drank a whole bottle of water. You were really thirsty, you drank a whole bottle of water, but your thirst is quenched, right? How does your body, and why does your body quench your thirst so fast when it hadn't even had time to get in your bloodstream? It's a homeostatic thing. You can drink a whole lot of water before it actually hits the body, but we don't want overkill here. We don't want to drown ourselves, and that can't happen. So your thirst is quenched pretty fast. This mechanism is overall pretty good for us until we're go run a marathon or until we're in a major athletic event. Sometimes we don't drink enough because we haven't fulfilled our needs. Because in an activity such as an athletic event, we lose so much water that it's, if we don't drink enough to replenish that, then we could have some dehydration to occur. So it's a good mechanism to have, but you have these quick outcomes that says, okay, I'm good, I don't need any more to drink. Sometimes our body does actually need more in cases where we have extreme exertion. But your dry mouth goes away pretty quickly. Activation of stomach and intestinal stretch receptors saying, hey, we're full. Because you can only hold so much, right? Even though it's not immediately being put into the bloodstream, our bodies are made to only intake so much. All right, obligatory water loss. Basically, I told you what insensible water loss is, and that's pretty much everything you lose that's not as a result of urine. So feces, lungs and skin, all of these you're going to lose on a timely basis. That's regulation. Minimal daily sensible water loss of 500 mL in urine to excrete waste. And this is when your body goes into making concentrated urine. So at a minimal, if you're dehydrated, you're going to get rid of 500 mL of urine when you get dehydrated. And that's when you're making major concentrated urine. Your antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone system's all kicked in, so your body's in conservation mode. The body water and sodium content are regulated in tandem by mechanisms that maintain cardiovascular function and blood pressure, because so many things can happen to offset water and solute concentrations, right? Cut your arm off. Cut your arm off, you're going to lose a lot. If you get severely burned, you're going to lose a lot of water. So, if your body goes through a traumatic event like this, your body goes into full-fledged mode of conserving water, making real concentrated urine, and of course your renin-angiotensin system is kicked in because you've had low blood pressure as a result of a traumatic event. If your blood pressure gets too low or you lose too much blood, you'll go into a situation called hypovolemic shock. And hypovolemic shock is one of the things, of course, if you're in that, you're going to be conserving all your water. So, all this is total review because water reabsorption in collecting ducts is proportional to antidiuretic hormone release. So, if you're conserving water, antidiuretic hormone is releasing, that tells your body, conserve water, conserve water, conserve water. If the antidiuretic hormone goes down, your urine is going to be really dilute. So you don't need it. Remember, your body works to not drown itself. It's going to keep your water homeostatically balanced, considering that everything's going right. So if antidiuretic hormone is really low, your body's going to be in dilute urine mode, and it's going to be working to decrease the volume of the body fluids. Because remember, the renin-angiotensin system is activated in a situation of low blood pressure. If antidiuretic hormone goes up, your body is in total conservation mode of water. So you're making concentrated urine. You guys already know all this. The hypothalamic osmoreceptors are the ones that trigger and inhibit antidiuretic hormone. We know that because where is antidiuretic hormone released? What endocrine gland? Do what? What endocrine gland releases ADH? This is final exam questions. What? The pituitary. Very good. Now the pituitary did not make it. What makes it? What makes ADH and oxytocin? It ships it to the pituitary. The hypothalamus. Very good. Now how is your kidney? Just wait on here. It makes sense if the hypothalamus and the pituitary are right there close together, right? Remember that little stalk, the infundibulum stalk that connects them? And there's a little port system. The hypothalamus would make its hormones, ship it to the pituitary. Does anybody even remember which part of the pituitary? It was either anterior or posterior. Which one? Posterior. Very good, Zach. So, antidiuretic hormone is in the posterior pituitary. Hypothalamus either says release it or don't release it. It made it. It puts it there, and then it's like the command center. It's going to control whether it's released or not. This is all review, okay? So, as a result of the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, it's going to determine whether that's released or not. And, of course, that's going to have to do with solute concentration. Other factors that may trigger ADH release from the pituitary, large changes in blood volume, right, or pressure. Also fever, sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, anything that's going to cause the blood pressure to go down, blood loss, traumatic burns. So anything that causes basically a form of dehydration, water loss, is going to trigger antidiuretic hormone. Now, so in the extracellular fluid, we can lose out of our ECF pretty quick. Hemorrhaging, severe burns, all those things that I just talked about a second ago. Taking too many diuretics can really cause the ECF to lose a lot of water. Well, of course, if the ECF loses a lot of water, what is that going to do to the ICF? Water's going to come out to try to equilibrate because water follows solutes, and it also, remember, osmosis and diffusion going on, so water's going to end up coming out. Signs of this: thirst, dry flush skin, oliguria, meaning you can't go to the bathroom, so you're not urinating. So all of these are signs of you don't have enough fluid. This can lead to weight loss, fever, mental confusion, the hypothalamic shock that I talked about, and of course, loss of electrolytes. So it's kind of like this faucet right here is kind of showing you how osmosis works, and it's really diffusion as well. So when you're dehydrated, you've lost a lot of ECF. So what happens? This is showing you from the ECF water leaving your body. This cell is going to shrink. It's going to start putting water into the ECF to try to equilibrate. This also happens the other direction. You can and will die if this happens. You can overhydrate. But most of the time our body has these really, really, really cool mechanisms to keep that from happening. Obviously urination, all these hormones that go on, the hypothalamus saying, hey, we're not thirsty. I mean, there's a point where you don't want anything else to drink. So cellular overhydration is also called water intoxication, and basically renal insufficiency can cause this to happen, and obviously that would cause it to happen because, like, when we drink a lot of water, we automatically go to the bathroom, urinate, right? We'll get rid of it. That's a quick fix. So if your kidneys are not working correctly, this would be a situation where you could experience hypotonic hydration. If you can drink too much water at one time. Then the ECF is diluted, which when it's diluted is you've got a lot of water. You've got net osmosis into the tissue cells because the water is going into the cells. They swell up. Severe metabolic disturbances can occur as a result of this. You can become nauseous, vomiting. Obviously, vomiting would make sense because you lose a lot of fluid that way. Muscular cramping, cerebral edema, possible death from this overhydration of the ICF. So it's just like the faucet went the other way. Simply that. You drank too much water, you've got too much, your kidneys are not getting rid of it, and it moves into these cells. Remember, these are just animal cells. What happens to animal cells in a hypotonic solution? In hypo, they swell and they can explode, right? So you can destroy. Hypertonic solution is where they shrink. Hypotonic means that the water will come in and cause them to burst. If you're a plant cell, that's okay, right? You like to be hypotonic because you got a cell wall. No big deal. But animal cells do not have the cell wall, so they can actually burst if they get to be too full. So, back to our electrolyte balance, which causes water to move. We've got our salts and our acids and our bases, electrolytes. When we talk about our electrolyte balance, we're usually talking about our salts. Whenever Gatorade sells you the little pitch and says, hey, I'll replace your electrolytes, they're talking about sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride ions. Those are your electrolytes. So salts enter the body by ingestion and are lost via perspiration, feces, and urine. So this is how they come in. This is how you lose them. We know they're extremely important. This is all basically review. We've talked about this before. We just talked about the fact that they're extremely important in fluid movement. Where you've got solute, you've got water. Water follows sodium. That's kind of the rule of thumb that we've talked about. Excitability. We know that they're electrical. We know that in order for a muscle to contract or a nerve impulse to fire, we've got to have these electrolytes. Also, secretion activity. Remember all the different pumps that we've talked about. These ions have to maintain a certain concentration. Membrane permeability. So you probably remember we've talked about this from AMP1 to up to this date. The membrane permeability is dependent upon what is present, and ions are extremely important in determining whether the membrane permeability is good or bad. So let's talk about sodium specifically. Whenever I say the word sodium, what hormone comes to your mind? Just in general. Does a particular hormone come to your mind? I say the word sodium, and you think this hormone. This will be the third time that I've asked you this question. Very good. Thank you. Aldosterone. What is the chief goal of aldosterone? Sodium conservation. We've been tested on it twice already. So now we're going for a third try. You're going to get it this third time. So aldosterone is major goal here. Sodium reabsorption. Now, where do we find sodium? Where is it made? Think back to the graph on page 997. We talked about where all these ions are. Sodium was really abundant in a certain place. It is the ECF, extracellular fluids. Remember, if it helps you, outside of the cell, think of it outside the cell and inside the cell. But on the test, it's going to be ECF and ICF. But, get that in your mind, what's going on and what it means. Outside of the cell, we've got, what's your principal cation? I just asked you the same question in a different way. What is your principal cation? Sodium, okay. What was your principal anion? She said it. Anion means a negatively charged electrolyte. And she said chloride ion. If I go into the cell, intracellular, what is my major cation? Very good, John. Potassium. What is my major anion? anion. Phosphate. Okay. All right. So y'all are making that. Y'all are just distinguishing that. So now, we know we're at the most abundant cation, sodium in the ECF. Sodium salts in the ECF contribute significantly to concentration. I'm not going to ask you any numbers, how much. That's not nor here nor there for this. Okay, so you don't have to understand the concentrations. All I need you to know is what's high, what's low, what's high, what's low. I'm not asking you anything beyond that. So pay attention to those things. I skipped a couple of slides. Which way did I go? There we go. Sodium leaks into the cell and is pumped out against its electrochemical gradient. Where have you seen that before? The pumping of sodium out of the cell. The sodium-potassium pump, guys. Okay, so when sodium rushes into the cell, it's got to get back out, right? We caused an event to occur so it can be pumped back out to get to the ECF where it's supposed to be. Sodium content may change, but the ECF sodium concentrations remain stable due to osmosis. So osmotically, water's going to move, the sodium's going to move out, and mainly through diffusion. Sodium leaves, water follows it. So our body maintains this chemical gradient. It maintains that the sodium and the chloride ion are going to be really excessive outside in the ECF, and internally in the ICF they're going to work to homeostatically maintain a small concentration, and the potassium and the phosphate is going to be big time inside and smaller outside. Now, changes in plasma sodium levels. Now, this is in the blood. The plasma is the water part of the blood. That makes a big difference in your blood pressure, obviously, right? Because more water in the blood, more plasma in the blood, is going to do what to your blood pressure? Increase it. So lots of water loss in this arena is going to decrease your blood pressure. Makes sense? So we have renal acid-base control mechanisms that are also coupled to sodium ion transport to maintain ICF and IF volumes and your plasma volume and your blood pressure. So all of that is regulated. We've talked about these different mechanisms. So the overall gist of the chapter, guys, is the importance of fluids, how they're affected by electrolytes and non-electrolytes, and acid bases. I've told you this before. I've mentioned this several times. We don't have receptors that monitor sodium levels in our body fluids. Where are the only sodium receptors that we've really talked about? That's not a receptor, but that's a hormone that's in response to low sodium levels. But I've told you guys, hey, in our fluids there's no receptors. There's only one place that we know of that monitors that, and we talked about in the urinary system. Our kidneys have receptors that monitor the sodium. Remember? I was talking about that. But we don't have anything throughout the body to monitor those fluids. So sodium water balance is linked to your blood pressure and blood volumes. So the blood pressure and blood volumes are extremely important. So if your blood pressure gets too low, what's going to happen? What's the whole system called? What happens? The whole thing. The renin-angiotensin system is going to kick in. As a result of renin being released, remember, from the JGA cells of the juxtaglomerular apparatus, it's going to activate angiotensin 2. Then aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone both are activated as a result of this whole system of low blood pressure. That's the 4th time I've explained that. Y'all got to know and understand the renin-angiotensin system, what's happening, because it is so integrated to this whole fluid balance system in our bodies. So that's important to understand. So it's linked to the blood pressure. So sodium is monitored. Remember, there's no receptors that specifically monitor sodium It's monitored by your blood pressure. Your blood pressure drops too low, it's going to activate that whole system. If it gets too high, then ANP will release. I can't ever say that word. Atrial natriuretic peptide from the heart. Y'all remember the ANP? It is antagonistic to the renin-angiotensin system. And I mean, that's in a nutshell. Blood pressure gets too high, ANP is going to release. It's going to do the opposite things. All right, we've talked about this. We know where sodium reabsorption occurs when we're talking about the kidneys, right? We just got finished with that. You were just tested on where things are absorbed and what happens. Remember everything that happened in the DCT? That was all hormonally controlled. Y'all remember that? So basically, when the proximal tubules coming right out of the glomerulus, 65% of the sodium is reabsorbed. 25%, remember, is reclaimed in the loop of Henle. We covered that last chapter. Aldosterone is going to increase your active reabsorption of the remaining sodium. And remember, in the DCT, because the DCT is totally controlled by hormones. If you don't have any of those hormones released, there will be no sodium reabsorption here. And remember, water follows sodium, especially if antidiuretic hormone is present. What is ADH telling your body to do? Conserve water. So it's another mechanism that's going to actually conserve sodium because it's conserving water. Because water follows salt. So the renin-angiotensin system, what happens? Well, the granular cells of the JGA that we just talked about, they're going to release renin as a result of a low blood pressure. Blood pressure drops. Sympathetic nervous system stimulation occurs when you're in sympathetic mode. You're going to be in conservation mode anyway, because you went into fight or flight mode, right? So you're not going to be getting rid of sodium, and you're not going to be getting rid of water. That's just the way it goes. So that's like an automatic, or an automatic switch for conservation of water and sodium. Of course, the filtrate osmolality, if it drops, what does that mean? If filtrate osmolality drops, what did I just say? Osmolality is solute concentration. So I just said solute concentration dropped. Well, that makes sense. Solute concentration drops. What's going to happen? Renin-angiotensin system, right? And then a decreased stretch due to decreased blood pressure. Again, blood pressure goes down, activates renin-angiotensin system. So those are three different things. And the main one, guys, that we've talked about is decreased blood pressure. Well, we can't monitor sodium directly. So filtrate osmolality, when it drops, what's going to tell us it's dropped? Blood pressure going down, because we don't monitor that sodium. So you go into sympathetic mode, obviously you're not going to be urinating, period. You're going to be conserving sodium. You're going to be conserving water. Does that make sense? The permeability of the cell has to do with, what concentrations are present. But the question that I actually asked you was, what is filtrate osmolality? But yeah, permeability of the cells and what ions can go back and forth, that's going to be influenced as well. Renin, we know, is what causes, I'm going through the renin-angiotensin system for the third time, right? So it's going to click in at some point, and if it doesn't, I don't know how to make it, because this is going to go on the third time for sure. So renin is going to activate angiotensin 2. That causes aldosterone to release. What is the whole purpose of aldosterone? Okay. Now, thinking back to endocrine system, What is an ion that is in our fluids that's monitored? It's right there. Okay. So, remember, potassium and sodium are monitored by their concentrations in the body. So if potassium gets too high, our body's going to automatically conserve sodium, right? Because they're linked. So that could also cause aldosterone to release. Too high potassium levels. Got to balance out those potassiums because the potassium and sodium are released. I'm sorry, the potassium and the sodium they're not equal concentrations, but their concentrations are dependent upon one another. Remember the sodium-potassium pump. Aldosterone can take a while, hours, days. So once it's released, it can take a little while for that to actually occur. But the renin-angiotensin system is a long-term fix to a low blood pressure and to getting the sodium concentrations where they need to be. Now, A&P, what is the whole purpose of A&P? It's released by the heart, and what does it do? Reduces blood pressure. It does the opposite. It's released by the atrial cells in response to blood pressure going up. What does it do? It's going to decrease the blood pressure and your whole blood volume. Are we going to release antidiuretic hormones? Not so much. Renin and aldosterone, the renin-angiotensin system period is inhibited here. Okay? No antidiuretic hormone, no renin, no aldosterone, and of course in turn no angiotensin 2. All that, total opposite of A&P. It's going to increase the excretion of sodium in water, which is the exact opposite of what we did in the renin-angiotensin system. A little trigger happy. So, you now understand, I hope, 100% the renin-angiotensin system and A&P and how they control fluid balance. Because like I said, it's also going to it's going to inhibit these things. You're not going to release ADH, and you're not going to release renin or aldosterone. Your body basically goes into a mode of getting rid of that extra blood volume to decrease your blood pressure. Yeah. Your blood vessels can take on two different states. They can either be tightly compacted and constricted, or they can be dilated. And vasodilation and vasoconstriction are also really important to blood pressure maintenance. So all of those things considered, A&P is going to do things to make your blood pressure drop. And renin-angiotensin system is going to do the exact opposite. Now, these are also influenced by other hormones. We've even talked about estrogen relative to calcium, right? Is estrogen really important in calcium reabsorption in females, in the bones, bone deposition? Very much so. We saw that when we dealt with the rat, right? The rat, I think we cut out the rat's ovaries, and so we did a couple of different things. We took the rat, gave him saline, estrogen, and calcitonin, and what we saw was that estrogen made a great impact. Calcitonin didn't make as big of an impact because in humans, it really is not that impactful in bone deposition. It is antagonistic to parathyroid hormone. What is the goal, what is the overall goal of parathyroid hormone? To keep calcium where? The blood levels at a certain level. So calcium blood levels have to be at a certain level. And if they drop, where does the calcium come from? The bone. So parathyroid hormone is going to actually stimulate the breaking down of the bone. Does anybody remember what cell that stimulates? Osteoclast. So it's going to stimulate, parathyroid hormone would stimulate osteoclast, bringing the calcium out of the bone into the bloodstream. Whereas estrogen kind of does the opposite in females. Also, aside from the calcium, estrogen is also important in sodium chloride reabsorption. So it has some similar functions of aldosterone in the female. So it's going to keep sodium chloride reabsorption up. This also, because of this, because we conserve so many salts, water retention during the menstrual cycle can occur, edema, swelling and edema, and pregnancy, which my last pregnancy, I was a walking example of that. This time hadn't quite been as bad, but you can experience severe swelling. In my case, it was Flintstone feet. I had no distinguishable feet as a result of it. This time has not been that bad. I actually have ankles and distinguishable structures on my limbs, so I'm happy about it. But as a result of estrogen increasing, that can cause. And then progesterone does the opposite. So it's going to cause sodium reabsorption to decrease. It also blocks aldosterone, so it's going to promote sodium and water loss. So you see how in a female, these two hormones can be antagonistic to one another in these particular cases, considering these ions. Also, the glucocorticoids that we talked about, they increase sodium reabsorption and promote edema. Aldosterone being one of them. Do y'all remember talking about the glucocorticoids and the adrenal gland and aldosterone? That was the one we talked about. Now the heart, cardiovascular-wise, we just talked about a hormone concerning the heart. What did we say about the heart? ANP. So we talked about ANP. Baroreceptors alert the brain of increases in blood pressure and volume. Sympathetic nervous system impulses to the kidneys decline. So sympathetic nervous impulses, when they're sent out, of course, the kidneys kind of quit. There's blood supply is not going towards them. We're not making urine. Afferent arterioles. What's afferent mean? Towards. Okay, so those arterioles will dilate. Your glomerular filtrate rate will increase, and sodium and water output increase. So all of these can happen. All of these things happen as a result of blood volume. Whether your blood volume goes up, your blood pressure goes up, or your blood volume goes down, causing your blood pressure to go down. All right, potassium. So where is potassium abundant? The eye. Okay, intracellular, ICF. Okay, so it's really important. Remember, neurons and muscle cells, especially cardiac muscle, are innervated as a result of sodium and potassium. If the potassium goes up in the ECF, is it supposed to be really high in the ECF? No. So, if you'll remember when we talked about a nerve impulse and traveling, we talked about depolarization. Does everybody remember depolarization? If you remember depolarization, one of the first things that would happen is the sodium channels would open up, and all this sodium floods in from the outside. Well, at the end of that, potassium channels open up, and all this potassium leaves. That's how an impulse travels. So, during depolarization, ECF potassium levels go up extremely as a result of that. At this point, if you remember, guys, there was a point at which those potassium channels were open. We had what we called the absolute refractory period. Nothing could happen. So that's what they're talking about, reduced excitability. It can't fire again right then. It's just not possible. And so whenever these extracellular levels of potassium go way up, that's during depolarization. And that's the absolute refractory period that we've talked about. Then the potassium tries to, remember that the cell membrane tries to get back to having the sodium and the potassium where they need to be, outside and inside. So the cell works to get that back together. If you'll remember, we had hyperpolarization where we had just a little too much potassium get into the ECF. And again, you have non-responsiveness during hyperpolarization. This was called the relative refractory period, where an extreme impulse could actually cause it to fire. That's all I was talking to you about. So you're really, really getting a lot of detail about how important those sodium and potassium levels are, especially to muscle contraction and nerve impulses. let's talk a little bit about the hydrogen ions. When you think of when you see a hydrogen ion that looks like that, what do you think of? Hydrogen ions. How are they important to you? This has to do with acids and bases. The acidity and the basicity of the body. Hydrogen ions are extremely important to that. And they shift in and out of our cells. These also lead to corresponding shifts in potassium in the opposite direction to maintain a cation balance. So our bodies maintain the plus charges and the minus charges. When it comes down to it, our body's maintaining that. Now it's really important of where it is, because we want sodium in the ECF, we want potassium in the ICF. But when it comes down to it, our body is maintaining a bunch of pluses and a bunch of minuses. And those pluses and minuses, why are they so important? Because of the excitability of those cells, the nervous impulse. When it boils down to it, the electrolyte is excitable. And all it has to do with pluses and minuses. And if you don't have the right amount of pluses over here and the right amount of minuses over here, no electrical charge can occur. Ask any electrician. Your body works kind of like it, just like electricity. All right, the regulation of potassium balance. We've already talked about this a little bit. Potassium balance is controlled in the cortical collecting ducts by changing the amount of potassium secreted in the filtrate. But if your potassium gets too high in the ECF, then your principal cells will secrete potassium. So you'll secrete it. When they're too low, you have specific cells that reabsorb it out of the filtrate. And remember, this is talking about urine filtrate. So remember, whenever all of this is going through the urine, the kidneys have the nephrons that have receptors that are monitoring sodium and potassium levels, and when to get rid of the sodium and potassium, when to keep the sodium and potassium. And of course, aldosterone can be influenced by potassium. If your potassium levels get too high, aldosterone can release, and we have major sodium reabsorption. So increased potassium in the adrenal cortex, because remember, the adrenal cortex is where aldosterone is made, is going to stimulate the release of aldosterone and, of course, potassium secretion as a result of that. Because we're trying to, remember, balance sodium with potassium. Sodium and potassium are interrelated in their concentrations. You know about the regulation of calcium. Calcium in the extracellular fluid is important for many different things. Neuromuscular excitability, we've talked about that in nervous system. Blood clotting, think back to blood. Remember, we talked about it in blood clotting. Calcium had a major role in that. Cell membrane permeability, secretory activities, all of these are influenced by calcium. Now, let's just say calcium gets too high. Hypocalcemia. This will be increased excitability of muscle. Tetany, this is when you can experience those uncontrolled movements as a result of too much calcium. So blood calcium is really important, right? ECF levels. Hypercalcemia means they get too low. What happens to our body when our blood levels get too low? Our calcium levels get too low in our blood. We do. We eat our bones to pieces, and what hormone does that? No. You said it, Sean. No. Well, what hormone, though, stimulates those osteoclasts? Parathyroid hormone. Anybody remember what endocrine gland makes parathyroid hormone? Oh, wow, no, it's the parathyroid gland on the thyroid. Guys, how do y'all forget all of this? We just covered it, chapter 16. All right, remember the thyroid gland, and it had these little parathyroid glands on it. They were so important because they regulate calcium balance in the blood. The thalamus? Your thalamus degrades? Please tell me no. You remember the thalamus is the egg-shaped structure in your brain that everything synapses through and radiates to the rest through your brain. You're talking about the thyroid. You're talking about the where T lymphocytes are made. Um, it just left me. The thymus. You're talking about the thymus. You, you said thalamus, but you meant to say thymus. You're close. You're close. All right. So that's how calcium um, is monitored. So when calcium drops too low in the blood, what hormone releases? Parathyroid hormone. Which endocrine gland makes parathyroid hormone? The parathyroid glands, which are remember, 4 little specks on the thyroid. What cells are they stimulating? Osteoclast, which is going to break down bone. All right, so y'all got that. We're going to stop right there, and you just went over the slide. You just told me that. So y'all tell me to come to slide 37, okay? Slide 37 for this chapter. And y'all have a great day. Thank you.